Hi everybody, this is Holly and welcome back to my Southern California Zone 9B garden. It's the end of March and the garden is starting to look very good because we're finally starting to get some sun. So today I want to talk to you about in bed or in raised bed worm composting. It's also sometimes called vermicomposting. And I want to talk to you about a system that I've been using for a couple of years now that I've been super happy with. So I want to tell you a little bit about that, what it is and why I like it so much. And so this is a method that I actually originally got from Angela from Growing in the Garden, and that's her channel on YouTube. And then I changed it in order to meet my needs and to make it a little bit easier for me. So why would I want to have worm composting in my raised beds as opposed to having kind of my own separate tubs for vermicomposting, which is pretty popular? Well, there are a number of reasons and there are a number of advantages. So first of all, I don't really have room in my house for tubs for worm composting bins. And for a large part of the year, it's far too hot and dry here to have the worms outside. And so what I really love about this system of in-ground buckets that I dig into the beds is that the worms have a safe place to hide out. They can burrow deep in the soil when it gets too hot or when it gets too cold. And I don't have to worry about taking care of them. And I also don't have to worry about having that space in my house during the hottest months of the year. So that's really great. And there are also a number of other really wonderful advantages. One advantage, especially for, again, my hot, dry climate, is that the compost and the scraps and stuff inside, they stay moist. And that's really the biggest barrier to making good compost in my climate, is it's just not wet enough. And so in the summer, I'd have to be hosing it down probably twice a day. And I don't want to have to be doing that. So it always stays moist. It actually composts pretty quickly. So you don't have to wait a year, or you don't have to do an intensive hot composting method with lots of stirring and layering in order to get it to go fast. You can kind of let it go on its own and it will turn into pretty good compost usually within 3 or 4 months. So that's pretty quick. Another advantage that I think is super important is that this brings worms into your garden beds. That is, if your raised beds are open to the ground, and mine are. Mine are just on bare dirt. They do have some hardware cloth underneath, but the worms, they can come up into the beds. So when they smell all those lovely kitchen scraps and they want to come and eat them, they come into my beds, they eat the scraps, they pull the compost out throughout the beds, they go to the bathroom in the beds, which is what we really want, right? We want the worm castings to fertilize the soil. And they do all of this without any input from me. And the compost they make is also really excellent. Not only is it fast, but it's some of the best quality compost that I make in my garden. Another advantage is just how easy it is. So I take out my bowl of kitchen scraps, or actually usually it's my husband doing it, and you just dump in your scraps and then you dump in some kind of dried brown material on top and just let the worms do their job. So that's another thing, is it really just kind of takes care of itself, which I really enjoy. So those are some of the advantages to this system. And now I'm going to go through and tell you about how I make these buckets, and then also kind of things to consider as you're using them, such as, what kinds of stuff to put in them, what not to put in them, and so forth. So we'll be talking about that next. So now that I've told you a little bit about my in-ground worm composting system, I'd like to talk to you about how I actually do this. So I use food grade 2-gallon buckets from my local big box store and with a lid. And the reason why I use food grade is just I'm not a fan of using plastic in the garden or anywhere really. But in this case, plastic is my best and easiest option. So I want it to at least be food safe, because I am going to be putting it into beds where I'm going to be growing my food. So those are the buckets I use. The reason why I use the 2-gallon ones is because I tend to like to do square foot gardening, and they fit perfectly into a square foot. But you could use a larger bucket, you could use a smaller one if they make them. It's really up to you. And so then what I do is I just drill holes in it. I drill holes in the sides and in the bottom, and you don't really have to be exact in terms of the number of the holes or the size of the holes. Just think that when you're drilling the holes, you want the holes to be big enough for a worm to fit through. And in terms of number of holes, I don't know, you'll see in the video, I just kind of wing it. So again, it really doesn't need to be an exact science. And then what I do is I dig out the area in my garden bed where I'm going to put it and insert the bucket down into the bed. And it's a good idea to let the lip, or have the lip of the bucket stick out above the ground a couple of inches. Again, it doesn't have to be exact. Usually when I fill my beds, the top of the bucket is about 1 inch above the surface of the soil, but then as the organic matter breaks down and the soil sinks, then it might stick up 3 or 4 inches until I decide to fill it again. And then I cover it, with a lid once I've filled it. And we'll talk about filling it in a minute. And I have a range of raised beds. They're usually anywhere from 24 to 27 square feet. And I usually put 1 bucket per bed. But again, that's really up to you. I've seen people put 2 buckets per bed, 3 buckets per bed. It just really depends on how many buckets you want in there. And do keep in mind that you will lose some growing space for each bucket that you put in. And so that's really the reason why I just have 1, is because I don't want to lose any more square footage in my bed than that. But it's worked out perfectly fine for me, and it's made the soil in my raised beds amazing thanks to the worms. So once you've made your bucket and you've buried it in your bed, the next thing you want to do is start to fill it. And I found the best way to do that is to add dried brown materials first. And I've used a number of things. I've used dried leaves. I've used aged coconut husk mulch that's kind of shredded up. I've used just a number of dried things, dried paper, shredded cardboard. So you could put it in, and again, it's not an exact science. You could throw down a layer of a couple of inches, and if it's dry out, you can hose that down and get it moist. And then you layer some kitchen scraps on top of that, and then you layer some more browns on top of that, and you don't have to be perfect, but if you just kind of alternating your kitchen scraps that are really moist with kind of your dried brown materials, you'll be fine. Now, as you're filling your bucket for the first time, that's at the point where you might considering purchasing and adding in worms. So I didn't do that. I didn't purchase any worms because my beds are open to the soil. So I knew that they were already there and they would just come, and they did. But if you're in a situation where, say, your raised beds are over concrete or gravel, and so worms from the environment aren't going to come in, you can purchase worms and follow package directions and just add them to your buckets. And then once you do that, over time, you just keep layering up your kitchen scraps with the dried brown materials. And what'll happen is the buckets will fill up and you won't have any more room. And if you just let it start to break down and settle, then you'll start to have a few more inches of room on the top, and then you can just add in another layer, and you can kind of keep doing this indefinitely. And you can make a choice. You can just keep doing that and keep bringing the worms to your bed. Or if you actually want finished compost that you can spread somewhere else, you can decide at a certain point that you're not going to layer it up anymore, and you're just going to leave it alone, and you're just going to let it completely break down. And that decision is up to you. And I do both. And I often keep layering up for quite some time before I decide that I'm going to just let it finish and then throw it on my beds. And so that's the thing, like, there are different ways the compost can get into your beds. So the worms will be kind of pulling organic matter in and out of those buckets. So they actually spread it around quite a bit. But then you can also do it. So if you let your compost finish completely, then what you could do is just dig it out with your hands or a trowel and spread it over your bed, or, put it wherever you want it. And so it's pretty easy. It's very versatile, and you can kind of just manage it the way you want. Like I've mentioned several times, it's not an exact science. I don't spend too much time obsessing over it and trying to get it perfect, and it works beautifully every single time and makes wonderful, wonderful compost. So I've talked to a lot of people about this in-ground bucket-based worm composting system, and I do get several questions frequently. So one of the first ones is, how many buckets do I need to make enough compost? And well, one of the things is that, the buckets aren't very large, so they're not going to make a huge amount, but a little bit of high quality compost can actually go a really, really long way. Another thing is, how many buckets do you actually need to sort of handle the number of kitchen scraps that you produce in your life? So there are only two of us, my husband and I, but we do follow a fully plant-based diet. So we have a lot of vegetable scraps. And right now I have buckets in 4 of my beds. So I have 4 buckets. And I would say it doesn't feel like enough to us. And I actually have some other composting methods that I use that are kind of like my overflow compost bins. But it's still, the buckets aren't enough for what we produce. And so I actually am going to add 2 more buckets into 2 more of my beds, probably sometime this spring, and see how that goes. So you can always try it out and then get a sense of how many kitchen scraps are you producing? Are you able to fit them all in the buckets, or do you need more? Another question I get is, do you need to water the compost that's in these buckets to keep it moist? And I'll say I've never had to, except for, the initial wet down when I put the first layer of dry materials in a new bucket. Where I, hose it briefly. I've never had to. And I think, and this is coming from a very hot, very dry climate in inland Southern California, which is almost desert-like most of the year. So I think what happens is, the bucket's buried, the soil is already moist because I have drip irrigation in the beds. There's a lid, the kitchen scraps are just full of moisture, and so it's always wet enough in there. Of course, your mileage may vary. Your climate might be quite different from mine. Another question that I've gotten from people in different locations is, what happens to the worms when it gets extremely hot? And then also people from colder climates will ask, well, what happens when the ground freezes in the winter? So as I mentioned, it's around 100 degrees here for several months out of the year. And I do see lower worm activity, but they just burrow deeper into the soil where it's cooler, and they live through the summer and it's fine. And honestly, the compost still breaks down quite nicely and quite quickly. I've done research on what happens in climates where the ground freezes, and earthworms have different ways of coping with the ground freezing depending on the type of worm. So for example, some worms just burrow really deep and they go below the frost line, even if the frost line extends like, say, 4 feet down. So for example, your standard night crawlers will do that. They'll burrow down. And then other worms just die, but their egg sacs do not. So one example of that would be like your common red wigglers. So the ground freezes, it's too cold, they die, but their eggs remain, and then they hatch whenever it gets warm enough in spring. So depending on your situation, and also depending on whether your beds are, open to the soil below or not, some of your earthworms will just burrow down to where the ground isn't frozen anymore and kind of hibernate, and other ones will die, but their eggs will remain, and they'll get going again as soon as it warms up in spring. Another question I often get asked is, what kinds of scraps can I put in these composting buckets, and what sort of things should I leave out? So I think it's easier to talk about what not to put in these buckets, and it's similar to what you wouldn't put in a regular compost pile. So you don't want to put in seed-bearing weeds, because you don't want those seeds to grow later. You don't want to put in invasive plants or diseased plants. The other thing is, you don't want to put in animal products. Eggshells are okay, but you don't want to put in meat. You don't want to put in dairy. You also don't want to put in fatty or greasy things, so oil, fat, grease. Those aren't good either. You also want to avoid the glossy paper. And then finally, any sort of sawdust from treated lumber or treated plywood. That's not good either. And it's pretty common for people to say that you can't or shouldn't put things like citrus and onions into a compost pile, and especially into a vermicomposting bin. I think that's really interesting because I grew up with my mother making amazing compost. She had regular compost piles. She also had vermicomposting bins. And we always put citrus and onions in, and it was never a problem. And the worms were always crawling all over them, eating them. So I've never had a problem with that. So I do put citrus and onions into all my types of composting bins, including these buckets. And we go through a lot of citrus because we have many, many citrus trees. And we go through a lot of onions as well. And it's just never caused a problem. And I see the worms eating them and all over them. So, you know, take that for what you will, but I've just never had an issue with it. So I don't worry about those ingredients. And one last thing I wanted to tell you about in terms of the kitchen scraps is sometimes you'll throw in scraps in these buckets, you'll leave it for a couple months, and then they'll actually start growing. So sometimes carrots will grow, green onions will grow, potatoes if you put in a piece that has an eye, and it's kind of funny to open it and see like you've got plants growing in there, and that's totally fine. All I do is just stir it and break it up so that those plants become composted as well. So it's just kind of funny and it's no problem at all. So with that, it's the video for today. I hope you enjoyed it. Please don't forget to like and subscribe, and also let me know. Do you compost? Do you do vermicomposting? Have you ever tried this sort of in-bed vermicomposting? Let me know, and let me know what you think about it. Thanks very much, and I'll see you next time.